The moment my mother handed my sister the silver key to my lake house, the entire room burst into applause like they were witnessing something beautiful instead of a theft. Crystal glasses clinked beneath the warm glow of chandelier lights. My father wrapped an arm proudly around Sophie's shoulders. And somewhere behind me, someone actually whispered, "It's about time the right daughter got the house." I remember standing there completely still, my fingers wrapped around the stem of a champagne glass I hadn't touched once all night, wondering how many people in that room already knew what my parents had done behind my back. If you've ever had family smile in your face while quietly taking something that belonged to you, you'll probably understand exactly why I didn't react right away. Most people think betrayal arrives loudly. It doesn't. Sometimes it arrives wearing pearl earrings and holding a champagne flute. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 31 years old, and 3 weeks ago, my parents signed my grandfather's $1.8 million lake house over to my younger sister while pretending it was what he would have wanted. The strange part is, I think they genuinely believed I would just accept it. The party was being held inside the house itself, which somehow made the whole thing feel crueler. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the frozen water outside, and the stone fireplace my grandfather built with his own hands crackled softly, while guests wandered through rooms filled with memories they knew nothing about. Sophie stood near the staircase taking photos for social media in a silk cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my first car. "Can you believe this view?" She laughed to her followers while spinning slowly beneath the chandelier. "I still can't believe this place is finally mine." Finally mine. The words hit harder than they should have, because the truth was, Sophie had barely spent 10 nights in that house her entire life. I was the one who drove up there every weekend during my grandfather's chemo treatments. I was the one refilling prescriptions at midnight, fixing broken pipes during winter storms, helping him into bed when his legs stopped cooperating near the end. My parents rarely came unless there were lawyers involved or photographs being taken. But Sophie had always been the center of gravity in our family. Growing up, she never had to ask twice for anything. New car at 16. Luxury apartment after college. Endless second chances wrapped in excuses about potential. Meanwhile, I learned early that being responsible just meant people expected more from you while giving you less. My mother suddenly lifted her glass with a bright, polished smile that looked almost rehearsed. "To Sophie," she announced proudly. "The daughter who finally knows how to preserve this family's legacy." More applause. More laughter. And then my father turned toward me for the first time all evening. "Claire," he said calmly, "you should be happy for your sister." Happy. I almost smiled at the irony of that word, because at that exact moment, standing beneath the framed trust certificate hanging over the fireplace, I noticed something that made my stomach drop cold. The signature date on the document was impossible. My grandfather died on October 14th. The document over the fireplace had been signed October 29th. For a second, all I could hear was the fire popping behind me and the soft piano music drifting through the dining room speakers. Everything else faded. The laughter, the conversations, the sound of Sophie bragging about remodeling the upstairs balcony into a wellness lounge. My eyes stayed fixed on that date like my brain refused to process what it was seeing. Then my mother noticed where I was looking. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said as she stepped beside me, smoothing invisible wrinkles from the sleeve of her cashmere dress. "Your father worked very hard to get all the paperwork settled, There was something strange about the way she said paperwork. Too careful. Too quick. I looked at her for a long moment, trying to decide if she understood what was hanging on that wall or if she had simply convinced herself long ago that anything benefiting Sophie automatically became morally acceptable. "You okay?" she asked softly, but not because she cared. It was the kind of question people ask when they are checking whether a situation is still under control. I smiled faintly. "I'm fine." Her shoulders relaxed immediately. That was the first moment I realized something important. They were afraid of me making a scene, not because they thought they had hurt me, but because appearances mattered more than truth in our family. They could survive guilt. They could not survive embarrassment. Across the room, Sophie called everyone into the dining area for a toast. Her voice carried easily, bright and effortless. The same way it always had. People naturally turned toward her. They always did. Before dessert, she announced, raising her glass, "I just want to thank Mom and Dad for trusting me with this home. I know Grandpa would have wanted it to stay with someone who truly appreciates it." I actually felt my pulse in my throat at that sentence. Because she believed it, that was the terrifying part. Sophie genuinely believed she deserved everything handed to her. I glanced again toward the trust certificate, then slowly pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands looked steady. They did not feel steady. Quietly, I opened the photo gallery and zoomed in on a picture I had taken in my grandfather's hospital room 11 months earlier. It showed him sitting beside the lake wrapped in a wool blanket, smiling weakly into the camera while signing paperwork on a clipboard balanced against his knee. I remembered that day clearly because his hands had been trembling so badly I had to help steady the pen between signatures. And suddenly, a cold wave of realization moved through me. The signature hanging above the fireplace did not just have the wrong date. It was too clean, too smooth, too healthy. Someone had copied it. My stomach tightened. I looked up slowly and scanned the room until my eyes landed on my father standing near the bar laughing with two men from his law firm. At that exact moment, his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He glanced down at the screen and all the color quietly drained from his face. My father recovered almost instantly. That was the thing about him. Richard Bennett had spent his entire life mastering the art of looking calm, while everything underneath him cracked apart. He slid the phone back into his pocket, forced a smile at the attorneys beside him, then reached for a bourbon glass, like nothing had happened. But I noticed the tiny details people usually miss when they are pretending. The stiffness in his shoulders, the way his jaw locked for half a second, the fact that he stopped making eye contact with anyone in the room. Something had gone wrong. Sophie was still talking near the dining table, laughing too loudly now, unaware that the atmosphere had subtly shifted. You could feel it if you paid attention. Like pressure building before a storm nobody else could see yet. I lowered my eyes back to the picture on my phone. My grandfather's signature, weak, uneven, Uman. Then I looked toward the framed trust document hanging over the fireplace. Sharp lines, confident strokes, almost elegant. It looked less like the signature of a dying man and more like someone trying very hard to imitate one. Suddenly, a memory surfaced, so clearly it made my chest tighten. 3 months before my grandfather passed away, I had walked into his study unexpectedly and found him arguing quietly with my father behind closed doors. Grandpa had looked exhausted that day, pale beneath the yellow glow of his desk lamp. One hand pressed against his ribs while my father stood over him with a stack of papers. "I already told you no," Grandpa had said sharply. "Claire understands responsibility. Sophie doesn't." The room had gone silent the moment they noticed me standing in the doorway. My father smiled immediately, too quickly, and slid the documents back into his leather briefcase. "Just boring estate planning," he had said casually. Grandpa never smiled back. At the time, I let myself believe it was just stress. Families survive on denial more than love sometimes. But standing there now, staring at that impossible signature, I realized something that made me feel suddenly cold all over. My father had not impulsively stolen the house after Grandpa died. This had been planned long before the funeral flowers disappeared. "Claire." Sophie's voice snapped me back. She walked toward me, holding her champagne glass carefully with both hands, her diamond bracelet catching the firelight. Up close, she looked almost nervous beneath all the excitement. "You've barely said anything tonight. What exactly would you like me to say?" I asked quietly. Her smile flickered for just a second. "I do feel bad about how this happened," she admitted softly, lowering her voice. "Dad said Grandpa changed his mind near the end because he thought I needed stability more than you." Stability. The word almost made me laugh. Sophie had never kept the same apartment longer than 18 months in her life. "Did Grandpa tell you that himself?" I asked. She hesitated. Tiny, barely noticeable. "But it was there." "No," she said finally. "Dad handled everything privately near the end." And right then, before I could answer, the front door opened. The entire room turned instinctively toward the sound. A woman in a dark wool coat stepped inside, carrying a thick leather file folder against her chest. The moment my father saw her, the bourbon glass slipped from his hand and shattered across the hardwood floor. The sound of breaking glass cut through the room so sharply that every conversation stopped at once. Bourbon spread across the hardwood in slow amber rivers while my father stood frozen beside the bar, staring toward the front entrance like he had just seen something impossible walk through the door. The woman removed her gloves calmly, snow melting from the shoulders of her dark coat onto the polished floor. She looked to be in her early 60s. Silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her neck. The kind of presence that made people instinctively lower their voices without understanding why. I recognized her immediately. Eleanor Whitmore. My grandfather's attorney. The real one. Not the smiling corporate lawyers my father kept close to him like bodyguards. A strange silence settled over the room. Even Sophie lowered her champagne glass slowly. Eleanor's eyes moved across the guests before finally landing on my father. "Richard," she said evenly. "I called 3 times this week." My father bent down too quickly, grabbing a cocktail napkin to wipe at the shattered glass even though one of the caterers had already rushed over. "Eleanor," he said with forced composure, "I wasn't expecting you tonight. Clearly." Her gaze drifted toward the framed trust document hanging above the fireplace. She did not blink. Interesting display choice. I felt my heartbeat harden inside my chest. My mother stepped forward instantly, slipping into the polished social smile she used whenever things threatened to become ugly in public. "Eleanor, we were just celebrating Sophie taking over the property. You should have called ahead. We would have prepared dinner." It was almost impressive how quickly she tried to normalize the situation. Pretend this was all perfectly legitimate, perfectly respectable. Eleanor ignored the offer entirely. Actually, she said, still looking at the document, that is exactly why I'm here. Nobody moved. The fire cracked softly behind us, somewhere near the kitchen. Silverware clinked as one of the servers awkwardly pretended not to listen. My father straightened slowly. And for the first time all evening, I saw genuine fear break through his calm exterior. "This isn't the time," he said quietly. Eleanor's expression did not change. "No," she replied. "The correct time would have been before you filed forged trust amendments with the county clerk's office." The room seemed to physically inhale. Sophie looked between them, confused laughter catching in her throat. "Wait," she said carefully. "What does that mean?" My mother answered before anyone else could. "This is ridiculous. Eleanor, I think you're misunderstanding. I am not misunderstanding anything." Eleanor opened the leather file folder in her hands and removed several documents clipped together with colored tabs. "Your father contacted my office 6 months ago, requesting access to revised estate drafts your grandfather explicitly rejected before his death." Sophie turned toward my father now, the color slowly leaving her face. "Dad," she whispered. But he still would not look at her. He looked at me instead. And suddenly, I understood something I should have realized much earlier. He was not afraid of Eleanor. He was afraid of what I already knew. "Claire," my mother said quickly, stepping closer to me now, lowering her voice into something softer, almost pleading, "whatever confusion is happening here, we can discuss this privately, as a family." Family. That word again. Used like a bandage over a bullet wound. I stared at her for a long moment before answering, "You stopped treating me like family a long time ago." Across the room, Sophie suddenly grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. "Dad," she said again, louder this time, "tell me this isn't true." My father finally lifted his eyes toward her. His face looked older than it had an hour earlier. Like the weight of every hidden thing inside him had finally become visible. Then Eleanor quietly slid one final paper from the folder and placed it on the dining table between us. The original trust agreement, signed in my grandfather's uneven handwriting, leaving the entire property to me alone, and underneath it, clipped to the final page, was a second document none of us had seen before. No one touched the document for several seconds. It sat there beneath the chandelier lights like something radioactive. Every eye in the room locked onto the uneven signature at the bottom of the page. My grandfather's real signature, fragile, unsteady, human. Nothing like the polished forgery hanging above the fireplace. I could hear Sophie breathing beside me now, short and uneven. Like the ground underneath her had suddenly become unstable. "What is that?" she asked quietly, though I think she already knew. Eleanor folded her gloves carefully before answering. "Your grandfather added a final condition to the estate 6 weeks before he passed away. My father moved immediately. That document is confidential," he snapped, his composure finally cracking hard enough for everyone to hear it. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. One couple near the staircase quietly picked up their coats. Eleanor did not even acknowledge him. "Your grandfather became concerned," she continued calmly, "that certain members of the family were attempting to pressure him into revising the trust while he was heavily medicated." The silence that followed felt suffocating. My mother's face drained of color so quickly it almost frightened me. Sophie looked back and forth between them with growing panic. "Mom," she whispered. "What is she talking about?" But my mother would not answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the second document, like she wanted it to disappear. Eleanor slid the page closer to me. "Read the final paragraph. Claire." My hands hesitated before picking it up. The paper felt strangely heavy. I recognized my grandfather's handwriting immediately. Small, shaky letters pressed unevenly into the page. "Claire, if you are reading this, it means Richard ignored my warning." I stopped breathing for a second. Around me, the room blurred softly at the edges, while Eleanor's voice faded into the background. All I could see was my grandfather sitting at the lake one winter morning, wrapped in his old navy blanket, telling me stories while snow collected silently on the dock outside. I had spent months convincing myself maybe I exaggerated the favoritism in our family. Maybe love just looked different depending on the child. But buried in those crooked handwritten lines was proof that my grandfather had seen everything clearly long before I did. I forced myself to continue reading. "Your father believes responsibility belongs to whoever profits most from it. He thinks love can be negotiated through paperwork. Do not let him turn kindness into weakness." Across the table, my father suddenly stepped forward. "That is enough." His voice came out sharper than I had ever heard it before. The entire room stiffened. Sophie stared at him in disbelief. "You lied to me," she asked quietly. "All this time?" "I did what was necessary," he said instantly. "Too fast. Too defensive. This family needed stability." "No?" Sophie whispered, tears gathering in her eyes now. "You needed control." That sentence hit harder than anything Eleanor had revealed all night. Because for the first time in her life, Sophie sounded exactly like me. My mother finally stepped in then, grabbing Sophie gently by the wrist. "Honey, your father was trying to protect this family. Protect us from what?" Sophie pulled her hand away. "Claire." The room went completely still again. My mother opened her mouth, but no words came out. And then Eleanor quietly spoke the sentence that changed everything. "Your sister was never supposed to inherit the house," she said, "because technically the property was never fully owned by your father's side of the family to begin with." The words landed in the room like a crack spreading through glass. Nobody spoke. Even the fire behind us seemed quieter somehow, reduced to soft, uneven pops beneath the crushing silence. Sophie stared at Eleanor as if waiting for her to correct herself, to laugh awkwardly and explain this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But Eleanor simply removed another document from the folder and placed it carefully beside the original trust agreement. "The lake house," she said calmly, "was purchased 37 years ago using money from Claire's grandmother's family trust." My father's face hardened instantly. "That is irrelevant." "No," Eleanor replied without raising her voice. "Legally, it is very relevant." My mother suddenly looked exhausted. Not shocked. Not confused. Exhausted. Like someone who had spent years carrying a lie so heavy she could barely hold it upright anymore. I noticed the way she avoided looking at me now. Or Sophie. Or anyone. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floorboards near the broken bourbon glass. "Mom," Sophie whispered carefully. Stepping closer to her, "Did you know about this?" My mother swallowed slowly before answering. Your father handled the financial side of things. It was not really an answer. Sophie realized that too. That is not what I asked. Her voice cracked, this time small, fragile, human. I had spent most of my life resenting Sophie for how easily love seemed to find her. But standing there watching her world collapse in real time, I suddenly understood something painful. Golden children do not realize they are standing on unstable ground until the floor disappears beneath them, too. Claire's grandmother left specific protections in place. Eleanor continued. The property could only legally transfer through direct custodial inheritance tied to caregiving provisions. My father laughed once under his breath. Sharp, humorless. Caregiving provisions, he repeated mockingly. You make it sound like this was some sacred moral arrangement. To your father-in-law, Eleanor said evenly. It was. My father's jaw tightened so hard, I thought something inside him might crack. I spent 20 years maintaining that property, paying taxes, repairs, insurance, using trust income generated from Claire's grandmother's investments. Eleanor answered immediately. Which your father-in-law documented extensively after discovering several unauthorized withdrawals approximately 9 years ago. The room exploded into whispers. Guests who had been quietly inching toward the exits now openly stared at my parents with the uncomfortable fascination people reserve for public disasters. I saw one woman subtly lower her phone after realizing she had accidentally recorded part of the confrontation. Sophie stepped backward slowly, like she no longer recognized the people standing in front of her. Unauthorized withdrawals. She repeated faintly, Dad, what did you do? Enough. My father's voice thundered through the room for the first time all night. The chandeliers almost seemed to vibrate with it. Everyone froze. He turned toward Eleanor fully now, no longer pretending calm. You have no right to come into my family's home and humiliate us with half-truths. This is not your family's home, Eleanor replied. That is the entire problem. My father looked at me then, and what frightened me most was not the anger in his face. It was desperation, raw and undisguised. Like a man watching years of carefully controlled narratives collapse all at once. Claire, he said suddenly, stepping toward me, you know how hard I worked for this family. You know the pressure I carried. His voice softened now, almost pleading. Your sister would lose everything if this becomes public. I stared at him in disbelief. Even now, after all of this, he still spoke as though I existed only in relation to Sophie's survival. You already made your choice? I said quietly. Something dark flickered across his face then. Not rage exactly. Fear mixed with calculation. And before anyone could react, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and placed it face down on the dining table directly in front of Eleanor. Then maybe, he said hoarsely, you should explain why Claire's name appears in the bank transfer records too. The entire room locked onto me so fast it felt physical. I stared at the phone on the dining table without touching it, while my father stood across from me, breathing heavily. His voice no longer controlled, no longer polished. It sounded desperate now. Dangerous in a quieter way. Go ahead, he said hoarsely. Show them the transfers. Sophie turned toward me slowly, her face pale beneath the chandelier light. Claire, what is he talking about? I could feel every guest in the room waiting for me to answer, waiting for the story to flip again. Eleanor reached toward the phone calmly, but I stopped her with a small movement of my hand. Because suddenly I understood exactly what my father was trying to do. He could not save himself anymore. So he was trying to drag me into the collapse beside him. The transfers are real, I said quietly. The room erupted instantly. Sophie's breath caught sharply. My mother looked at me in shock, genuine shock this time, while my father let out a short, bitter laugh like a man finally proving a point. "There it is," he snapped. "You want to stand there, acting innocent? Tell them where the money came from." I picked up the phone slowly. My own name appeared across a series of wire transfers, dated over the past 3 years. Large amounts, tens of thousands at a time. Enough to make anyone in that room question everything they thought they understood. Sophie stared at me like she no longer knew who I was. That hurt more than I expected. "Claire," she whispered, "did you know about this the whole time?" I closed my eyes for 1 second because suddenly I was back in a hospital hallway 3 years earlier, listening to my grandfather struggle to breathe while machines hummed softly around him. "Your father thinks money erases guilt." Grandpa had told me quietly that night, "Promise me you will not let him bury this family under his choices." At the time, I thought he meant emotional damage. I did not realize he meant literal financial ruin. I opened my eyes again and looked directly at Sophie. Grandpa found out Dad had been pulling money from the family trust for years. I said carefully, quietly, in small amounts at first, then larger ones after his business started failing. My father slammed his hand against the table hard enough to rattle the glasses. "I was protecting this family." "No," I said, my voice finally breaking. "You were protecting your image." Silence crashed into the room again. My mother covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Sophie looked physically ill now, tears slipping down her face as pieces of her entire childhood rearranged themselves in real time. "The transfers on that phone," I continued softly, "came from me." My father froze. After Grandpa discovered the missing money, he asked me to secretly help cover the trust losses while he rewrote the estate protections. Sophie blinked rapidly. "You gave money back into the trust." "Almost everything I had." My voice sounded distant, even to me. "Bonuses, savings, my retirement account." My father's expression changed then. Not anger anymore. Something uglier. Shame. Raw and unbearable. "You told everyone I abandoned the family for my career," I whispered. "But the truth is, I spent years cleaning up messes you created without letting Sophie or Mom find out." My mother slowly lowered her hand from her mouth and stared at my father like she was seeing a stranger sitting inside his skin. "Richard," she said faintly, "tell me she is lying." But he could not answer. Because for the first time all night, there was nothing left to manipulate. Nothing left to hide behind. Then Sophie suddenly stepped backward, tears streaming openly now, and looked directly at me with a shattered expression I will never forget. "You let me believe you hated this family," she whispered. And before I could answer, Eleanor quietly slid one final envelope across the table towards Sophie. "There is one more thing your grandfather wanted you to know," she said. The envelope sat untouched between Sophie and Eleanor for several long seconds while the room slowly emptied around us. Guests drifted toward the exits in uncomfortable silence. Coats pulled tightly around themselves, avoiding eye contact the way people do after witnessing something painfully intimate. The celebration lights still glowed softly across the dining room, but now they felt hollow somehow, like decorations left behind after a storm. Sophie stared down at the envelope with trembling hands. The mascara beneath her eyes had begun to smudge slightly, and for the first time in her life, she looked less like the center of attention and more like someone completely lost. "I cannot do this right now," she whispered faintly. "Yes, you can," Eleanor said gently. "Because your grandfather wanted you to hear his words directly, not through anyone else." Sophie finally reached for the envelope. The sound of the paper opening seemed strangely loud in the quiet room. My father sat motionless at the far end of the table now, staring blankly at the shattered remains of the bourbon glass still scattered across the hardwood floor. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, spiritually, like the version of himself he had spent decades constructing had finally collapsed under its own weight. My mother sat beside him with her arms folded tightly across her chest, eyes red, silent in a way I had never seen before. Not defensive. Not dismissive. Just tired. Sophie unfolded the letter carefully. Her lips trembled before she began reading aloud. "Sophie, if you are reading this, then it means I ran out of time before telling you the truth myself." Her voice cracked immediately. She stopped for a second, breathing unevenly, before continuing. "None of what happened between you and Claire was ever your fault. Children believe the version of love they are given." Tears slid silently down her face now. I looked away instinctively because something inside me hurt in a completely different way than anger. Grandpa always saw people clearly, even when they disappointed him. Especially then. Sophie swallowed hard and continued reading. "Your father confused admiration with control. Your mother confused peace with silence. And Claire carried burdens she should never have been asked to carry." My chest tightened painfully at those words. Across the table, my mother suddenly broke down crying without warning. Quietly at first, then harder. The kind of crying that sounds less like sadness and more like years, finally collapsing all at once. My father did not touch her. He just sat there staring ahead while the firelight flickered against his face. Sophie lowered the letter slowly and looked at me through tears. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. I thought about that question carefully because the answer felt heavier now than it once did. Because every time I tried growing up, I said softly, "You looked so happy being loved that way. And I did not want to be the person who ruined it for you." Sophie covered her mouth as another wave of tears hit her. The silence afterward felt strangely different from earlier, less explosive, more fragile. Like standing inside the remains of something after the fire already burned through it. Eleanor quietly gathered the legal documents back into her folder while snow continued falling softly outside the massive lake windows. Somewhere upstairs, I could hear one of the old pipes knocking faintly in the walls, the same sound Grandpa used to complain about every winter. For years, I thought this house represented everything my family stole from me. But sitting there now, watching the people I loved finally stripped of every illusion they built around themselves, I realized the house had never really been the point at all. Then Sophie looked down at the final page of Grandpa's letter, and her expression changed completely. "Claire," she said softly, almost in disbelief. "There is something else here." Sophie's hands tightened around the letter as she read the final lines, silently to herself. I watched confusion move across her face first, then disbelief, then something softer that looked dangerously close to grief. Outside the windows, snow drifted slowly across the frozen lake in thick, quiet waves. Covering the dock, Grandpa and I used to shovel together every winter morning. The house felt different now. Not warm, exactly. Honest. Like the walls themselves, we're finally tired of carrying secrets. What does it say? My mother asked weakly, her voice still fragile from crying. Sophie looked up slowly. Grandpa left the house to Claire, she said softly, but he left something to me too. Her eyes dropped back to the page. He said if I ever learned the truth, and if Claire was willing, the house was supposed to become both of ours. Nobody spoke. Even Eleanor seemed surprised by that. I felt something twist painfully in my chest because suddenly I understood exactly what Grandpa had been trying to do. Not divide us. Save us from becoming our parents. Sophie looked at me carefully now, like she was seeing me for the first time without years of comparison standing between us. Why would he do that after everything? She whispered. I thought about Grandpa sitting beside the fireplace late at night drinking weak coffee from his old ceramic mug, always saying family was complicated because people confuse love with ownership. Because he knew none of this was really about the house, I said quietly. My father finally lifted his head, then his eyes looked hollow now, stripped of all the certainty he carried his entire life. Claire, he said softly, I never wanted you to feel invisible. For years, I imagined hearing those words would heal something inside me. But standing there now, all I felt was sadness for how late they arrived. That was the problem, I answered gently. You never noticed that I already did. My mother began crying again silently beside him, her shoulders shaking while she stared down at her hands. Sophie walked slowly around the table toward me then, hesitant at first. Like someone approaching a stray animal they are afraid might run away. I do not know how to fix this, she admitted through tears. I honestly do not know where to even start. Neither did I. Some damage does not disappear because the truth finally shows up. But for the first time in years, the silence between us did not feel cruel. It felt unfinished. Human. I looked around the room one last time. The champagne glasses still sitting half full. Melted ice in forgotten drink buckets. Wrapping paper near the staircase from gifts nobody cared about anymore. Hours earlier, this house had been filled with performance. Now it was filled with something far more uncomfortable and far more real. Eleanor quietly closed her folder and moved toward the front door, giving me a small nod before leaving us alone with the wreckage of ourselves. My father remained seated at the table long after everyone else stopped speaking, staring at the fire as if trying to understand when exactly his life began slipping beyond his control. Sophie and I eventually walked out onto the back porch together, wrapped in winter coats, while snow settled softly across the railing. The lake was completely still. Grandpa used to say, frozen water only looks lifeless from a distance. Sophie murmured. I smiled faintly because I had not heard her mention him like that in years. We stood there quietly for a long time. And honestly, I still do not know whether families truly heal after things like this, or if they simply learn how to carry the truth differently. But if anyone listening has ever felt invisible inside their own family, or watched love get tangled up with favoritism, silence, or control, then maybe you already understand how complicated forgiveness can become when it finally arrives.